There being no confession, he would then take his chalk and board and sit down to cipher. In a few moments, he would musingly say, links 3 inches long, links 3 inches long, what does that mean? Then turning to his boy, he would say, Pomp, or whatever his name might be, Pomp, you have been stealing sausages. Pomp, astonished at such arithmetic, would say, no, massa, me no steal sausage, me steal cart chain. So what you're seeing here is a really disparagingly written, terrible story, but it is a recollection of a real thing that happened at that house on that spot where that school is currently located, involving an enslaved man who, for all we know, might have been named Pompey. And one scholar has looked at this passage and said what's really going on here is probably a reference to an African arithmetic magic that was practiced among enslaved peoples that the master is then kind of sarcastically pointing back to him, rather interestingly. But also on that spot, it's named after the Beebe family. And I went to the school, I never found out who the Beebes were. The Beebes, interestingly, made part of their fortune, the initial gains from their fortune, by moving to New Orleans and working in the cotton industry down there. They shipped cotton, they supplied cotton plantations. I have no evidence that they were trading in slaves, but this is where the money came from. And here is the father of Decius, for whom the school is named, was Lucius. This is just a passage about that, about how they moved down to New Orleans, and Silenda, his mother, who had rarely been out of sight of her serene New England hills, again, that kind of New England fantasy, the life of a little southern city behind the slow-moving, muddy river, with its Spanish and French traditions in imprint, must have been a strange and disturbing experience. The extravagance, the idleness, the drinking, the slouching, grinning Negroes, the pale Creole girls with their indolent, languishing beauty and wide gay skirts, the luxurious gardens overflowing with magnolias and so forth, quite different from her strict New England experience. Although she was happy, she never felt at home in New Orleans. She was always afraid of the fierce, slumberous river, the Negroes, the lurking deadly fever. It was not in her nature to throw off her anxiety and be gay with these carefree people who seemed, with their casual morality and thoughtless extravagance, to be setting at naught all the rules of rectitude which had been taught her. So again, you have a contrast of upstanding, white, WASP New Englanders heading to the south, encountering people of different races and hues, but then making money off of them, their unpaid labor, and then coming back, purchasing this, marrying into this land where they are right now, and actually using some of that fortune to start what is today the Melrose Cooperative Bank. So I bring this up just because on the site of this school, which is about to open, there is a really complex history that could be represented. It certainly could be represented in the curriculum. The children should be taught this, right? And this is just the site where we have the best evidence. It also could be dealt with by, changing the name of the school, which is always a very controversial thing. We got the name Beebe School because the last Beebe, who was a spinster daughter who was living there in 1962, gave the land to the city of Melrose and asked it to be named after her father. It's now been named after her father for 60 years. No one remembers her father. When I was a kid going there, I was never taught who he was. And just in general, on the subject of names, we have schools that are named after presidents. Everybody knows who President Lincoln was. Everybody knows who President Roosevelt was. If there are people worthy in our past who would make the city more diverse in terms of representation, maybe it's time to talk about that as well. And of course, John Winthrop, for the Winthrop School, was an investor in the slave trade also. I don't know if you heard the news, my third subject, but there is a building across from City Hall, that little building right there. And I discovered just a few months ago it was home to the first person of color in Melrose history to own his own business. A Chinese immigrant named Charlie Singh could never marry because he was here in the age of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and women had been excluded before that point. No new immigrants were allowed in. He thrived on that spot for about 15 to 20 years. The records aren't very clear. Had his business. He's actually mentioned in Goss's History of Melrose, ever so briefly. Oh yes, the spot of Charlie Singh's laundry. And then he probably moved back to China at that point. I think that's very significant because we have a large Asian American community growing here in Melrose, but obviously massive here in Malden, who will soon be moving up, most likely. That building, as of last Tuesday, it was under threat of demolition, and by a 6-0 vote of the Historic District Commission, it has been preserved. I will just toot my horn for just 1 second and say, if I had not been such a pain in the rectum to those folks, and kept mentioning that, hello, it is the first business owned by a person of color in Melrose, there's a chance they might have torn that down.
Do you think it's possible that that would be acknowledged with some sort of or is that your next slide?
Yeah, no, that was actually, no, it's just my next mention. In fact, I approached the Human Rights Commission while I was going about that and asked them to consider weighing in to save the building. They argued, I think quite rightly, that it's not the job of their commission to argue which building should be saved, but they did write a very nice letter saying there should be a plaque recognizing what happened on that spot, even if the building gets destroyed. So, yeah, so there's, and actually, Kate Lippert-Garabedian, city councilor, also wrote a letter about this saying no matter what happens to that building, she was in favor of taking it down. She said there should be a plaque put on that spot. So I think that's the easiest ask out of all of these. Although I can tell you where it would get held up. People would say, no, wait a second. Before you put up that plaque, we should have a comprehensive plan for all of downtown about making sure that everybody gets a plaque. And then all the white businesses will get their plaques too. Which, great, I would love that to happen. But yes, we could say, be a bit more insistent on that. And then finally, if we want to talk about white Melrosians, as we're here on Dr. King weekend, we do have a history as far as that goes here. So here you can see a gentleman by the name of Floyd W. McLaughlin, who died about 5 years ago. And he had been doing some work. He was a contractor doing some work on one of the very few on the homes of one of the very few black families living here in Melrose at the time. How many black families were there? That I don't know, because the census will list race. Any listing after that from this period, which is 1964, you wouldn't have a listing. But I can tell you that in 1940 there were exactly 4 black homeowners in that. So probably about the same. But as you can see, he had graffiti put onto his house, and he also had a Molotov cocktail thrown through the window of his home. So there has been a terrorist attack in the history of the city, and it was by a white supremacist. But the people of Melrose at that time were not silent. There was a Melrose City Civil Rights Committee, which I tend to think of it's like white people challenging racism, but 1 generation ago, and we've forgotten about it. And as you can see, they put out an ad in the paper saying that over 900 residents have signed a pledge to fair housing, meaning that they will support African Americans moving into their community. On the left there, you can't see it too well, but it is a page from a pamphlet they put out on how you can help black folks who move into Melrose and be good citizens. So it says that how you can help sign the Good Neighbor Pledge, and then there are suggestions there trying to raise awareness. It's often said that terrible things happen, and said far more eloquently than I'm going to say it by better people. The terrible things happen not because terrible people do terrible things, but because most people remain silent while those things go on. And here's an example of a group in Melrose that actually did something, came together and tried to push back against racism in the community. Mr. Floyd McLaughlin lived over on the east side. That house was on Laurel Street, I do believe, and the house he was working on. And the Common is a very large area. You could put up a little monument there to what happened and to the response to remember that, and people would pass by that. And then they would know, in the 1960s, and the kids would know, the civil rights movement was not something that just happened in the South. The civil rights movement happened right here. And so I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make, is that we've had the slogan for so long, and I'm wondering how could we make things visible and then therefore make this a bit more meaningful, both in terms of facing up to the facts that we have not been inclusive in the past, but also calling attention to those times when we have come together as a community and done something. So that's what I have to say. And now I'm really interested in conversation.